The subsequent evolution I envisage as follows. It was presumably soon after the third was recognized as a consonance that the possibility of contrary and oblique motion was discovered. In addition to parallel unisons, octaves, and fifths, there arose the possibility of parallel thirds, and probably soon thereafter, as I have said, the possibility also of contrary and oblique motion, hence an immense enrichment of means. Now it seems to me the following train of thought, only too firmly rooted in man's nature, gives psychological explanation of the question of forbidden fifths. Singing in octaves and fifths no doubt satisfied in a thoroughly natural way the taste of the time. It was in accord with the nature of sound and with the nature of man. Thus it was beautiful. Nevertheless, the possibility of adding thirds to the octaves and fifths and of using contrary and oblique motion very likely produced a heady enthusiasm that came to hold everything of an earlier time to be bad, although it was merely outmoded. Such enthusiasm we can indeed observe in every great advance, not only in art. The enthusiast so completely forgets to be grateful for the preparatory work done by the predecessors that he hates that work and does not stop to think that the present advance would be impossible without it. Yes, even if that work was full of errors, and the contempt for what is outmoded is just as great as it is unjustified. Whoever keeps a correct sense of proportion will say, I personally would not like to do what is outmoded because I know the advantages of what is new, and because it would be untimely. One should be untimely only in running on ahead of the times, but not in limping along behind. We are thus justified in making fun of someone who today writes gegen dem, but we should know that since gegen was in fact formerly used with both the dative and accusative cases, gegen dem is not false, only outmoded. And Schaunard was right when he characterized the style of his fellow Bohemian, Barbemuche, with a single word, hinfero, which allegedly often appears in Barbemuche's novel. I think that such observations concerning the human nature of the artist are just as important for judging the evolution of art as is physics. One must reflect that art has set its course not only by the nature of tones, but by the nature of man as well, that it is a compromise between these two factors, attempts at mutual accommodation. And since the tone, the inanimate material, does no accommodating, it is up to us. But we sometimes find accommodation difficult. Hence, when we have succeeded, we often overestimate our accomplishment and underestimate the accomplishment of those who took the preparatory step, a step perhaps as great and as difficult as the one we have taken. Such must have been the case with forbidden fifths. If the joy in the accomplishment keeps company with the demands of the guild, the child of this union can only be orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, which no longer has need to win recognition for the novel accomplishment, now assumes the task of holding fast to the accomplishment through exaggeration. It does, to be sure, think through and exploit the implications of its premises. Through its exaggeration, however, it not only leads to errors, but also erects a bulwark against any other innovation. Thus, one can well imagine how the following statements were interpreted. It is no longer necessary to compose merely in octaves and fifths. Thirds can be added to octaves and fifths. Contrary and oblique motion can be used, as well as parallel motion. One can well imagine, I say, how these were interpreted to read thus. It is bad to compose in octaves and fifths. Thirds must be added. The third must be added to octaves and fifths. Contrary and oblique motion are better than parallel motion. Now, if it be considered that such interpretations were given and accepted as rules whose violation placed one under an interdict, it can be seen how easily their origin could be forgotten, how easily it could be forgotten that octaves and fifths were not in themselves bad, but on the contrary were in themselves good, that they had merely come to be considered outmoded, primitive, relatively artless, that there was no physical nor aesthetic reason, however, why they should not on occasion still be used. And if one considers that these rules, in the form "thou shalt not," were spread abroad over centuries, then it becomes clear that the ear forgot the sound once found to be euphonious, and its use aroused antagonism because of the oddness the new always has about it. I am saying that since progression in parallel octaves and fifths was not practiced for centuries, the ear was disposed to regard the occasional appearance of such connections as new, as odd, whereas the opposite is actually the case. They were odd, they were old, only forgotten. And so it is no evidence against the view presented here whenever a musician says, "Yes, but I still notice these fifths. They call attention to themselves, and I think they sound unpleasant." The new does indeed always attract attention, and its sound is considered unpleasant, although it is not. And now, the hidden octaves and fifths. They are explainable quite simply on grounds of orthodoxy. Just in order not to write any open fifths or octaves, parallel movement into these perfect consonances was altogether avoided. Every attempt to deal differently with hidden parallels may be disregarded, not merely because even the open parallels do not sound bad, but above all because this law has been nothing but a phantom of the textbooks, whereas in practice, that is, in the masterworks, it has been more often violated than observed. How, then, should the pupil approach this problem of parallels? I want to deal with this question rather thoroughly now, because I intend later simply to refer back to this general discussion without going into its details every time. The question could be raised: if parallel fifths and octaves are not bad, why then should the pupil not be permitted to write them? My answer is this: he will be permitted to write them, but not until a later stage. The course of instruction should lead through the historical evolution. Should it not do so, should it give unsupported final results in the form of rules, then the petrifaction of these results, uprooted from the evolutionary thought processes that produced them, could lead to errors similar to those I have just exposed. And as instruction can restrain further development through too strict formulation, so it would always obstruct the view back into the past and would make incomprehensible much of what was once vital. For a similar reason, I am no friend of the new orthography, although I understand very well the practical advantage of brevity, and understand very well that the effort to express in spelling only what one actually hears spoken is in part justified. Nevertheless, I find it questionable to call out so unsparingly those symbols that often manifest rudiments of former syllables. The possibility of recalling the root word is easily lost thereby, and it is inaccessible to us whenever we want to trace the original meaning of an expression. and the danger arises that our script will become too poor in such points of reference as could indicate to anyone the way back to the origin. The origin will finally be known to historians alone, and will then have disappeared from the living awareness of everyone. Should harmony instruction proceed in a similarly thoughtless manner, then many problems of voice leading in the older masterworks would be beyond our understanding. And another thing, in the work of arranging and editing, so often necessary in those older works where the harmony is indicated only by figured bases, works which we make more accessible the more genuinely we reproduce their style, the use of inappropriate techniques of voice leading would inevitably produce incongruence between the content and the form of realization, incongruence offensive to the sensitive listener. Such incongruence would also result were the pupil to work out his assignments without regard for these prohibitions. Of course, if one were to write a harmony text that expressed only the harmonic taste of us ultra-modernists, allowing what we do, forbidding what we avoid, then all these considerations here could be discarded. Today, we have already come so far as to make no more distinction between consonances and dissonances, or, if a distinction remains, it is at most that we like to use consonances less. This is possibly just a reaction to the preceding epochs of consonance, an exaggeration perhaps, but to draw the conclusion that consonances are forbidden because they no longer appear in the works of this or that composer would lead to errors similar to those produced by our predecessors in junction against fifths, as far as I personally am concerned, but only because, in so long as I do not know better, I could easily say to a pupil, any simultaneous combination of sounds, any progression is possible. Nevertheless, even today, I feel that here, too, there are certain conditions on which my choice of this or that dissonance depends. Today, we do not yet stand far enough away from the events of our time to be able to apprehend the laws behind them. Too much that is unessential crowds into the foreground of our awareness, covering up the essential. If I stand in the middle of a mountain pasture, I see every blade of grass. But that is worth nothing to me if perhaps I am looking for the path to the summit. If I stand at some distance, the blades of grass escape me, but I shall probably see the path. I hold the opinion that the path, even this path, will somehow connect logically with the stretch already traveled. I believe that in the harmony of us ultra-modernists will ultimately be found the same laws that obtained in the older harmony, only correspondingly broader, more generally conceived. Therefore, it seems to me of great importance that we conserve the knowledge and experience of the past. Precisely this former knowledge and experience will show, I hope, how correct is the path along which we are searching. Moreover, should I allow the pupil from the outset to ignore the restriction on fifths, then I should have just as much right to disregard all those instructions that deal with the treatment of dissonance, tonality, modulation, etc. These, too, have now been superseded. Here again, we may not overlook the fact that only the small group of ultra-modern composers goes so far. Almost all great masters of our time, Mahler, Strauss, Rieger, Pfitzner, still adhere largely, for example, to tonality. A theory, a course of instruction that advocated only the goals of a presently small group, however rigorous the logic with which it were formulated, could be not unjustly criticized for being partisan, and precisely that which I am to give here, although it does not serve a particular party, or, far more, for that very reason, arrives at results considered correct by the group that thinks as I do. My aim is just that, to show that one must arrive at these results. Thus the pupil may as well follow the path taken by the historical evolution. If he is learning harmony only out of an interest in the music literature, if he only wishes to gain thereby a better understanding of the masterworks, then for him it does not really matter. For the short time he is himself creating musical patterns, whether he works out exercises in a modern or an unmodern style. What does matter, however, is that he be led to a correct attitude toward what is new. The purpose is accomplished by a course that, in its freedom from aesthetic preconceptions, reveals the mortality of many an eternal law, and gives thereby an unobstructed view of the evolution of the beautiful, that is, a view of how conceptions change, of how, by virtue of these changes, the new, which the ear of tradition proscribes, becomes the old, which is then pleasant to the ear, of how this new tradition in turn denies another still newer innovation, which is in turn temporarily proscribed access to the ear. If the pupil is a composer, however, he should patiently wait to see in which direction his development, his nature, will take him. He should not wish to write things for which only full maturity can assume responsibility, things that artists have written almost against their will, in obeying the compulsion of their development, in obeying this compulsion, but not out of the poorly disciplined wantonness of the one who, insecure in matters of form, writes arbitrarily. The pupil will, therefore, avoid open octaves and fifths as long as he has need of instruction, but he may use them at such time as his inclination, taste, and artistic understanding make it possible for him to take responsibility for them. Hidden octaves he may write now as he chooses, with a few exceptions that will be discussed as the occasion warrants. Hidden fifths he may use at any time without restriction.